everyone, welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria, you can call me Vic, and today I have a video that I think is a bit out of the normal. I think culturally it might be considered a bit morbid to talk about, but I do think that it is extremely important. And that is death and death anxiety. I really think that it's important to talk about because I feel like in general, Western culture, or at least culture in the US, doesn't give us a whole lot of space to talk about death anxiety, and definitely not death, not in any serious way, at least. Now, you might be wondering, why does death anxiety matter? You know, everybody's scared of death. But when I'm talking about death anxiety, I'm not talking about a general fear of death. You know, you might be thinking all living things are scared of death, and you would be right. For the most part, I'd say everybody is pretty scared of dying. It's an evolutionary trait that we have to keep us from doing stupid things that would cause us to die before reproducing. When I talk about death anxiety, I'm talking about this debilitating fear, this debilitating anxiety that follows thoughts of death and the afterlife that causes you to experience physical, emotional symptoms and can sometimes even disrupt your life and the choices that you make. Now, the easiest way to kind of explain death anxiety and also dive into why I'm talking about it, why I think it's important, and in some ways why I'm also qualified to talk about it, would just be to start with my story. Now, growing up, I really didn't have a lot of different experiences with death. I mean, I have the occasional extended family member who would pass away and we'd go to their funeral, but they weren't close to me. I maybe met them when I was a baby. They didn't have this profound impact on my life, so when they died, it was sad, yes, but it didn't affect me or make me kind of aware of death in the way that I might have been if it had been someone a lot closer to me. It wasn't actually until 2021 that I experienced my first loss that was somebody that was actually close to me. So in 2021, my granny died, my mom's mom. She did have cancer, and she'd kind of chosen not to continue fighting when the cancer had returned. So it was something that we knew was coming. We expected it. We had time to prepare ourselves. I was able to see her before she passed to say my goodbyes. I definitely think it was on the better end of how you would experience someone passing. So within several weeks after my grandmother passing and me kind of going through the grieving process, typically, you know, things start to get a little bit better. You're able to get through your days without crying. You know, your grieving moments tend to space out a bit further and further. But I noticed that even as my crying bouts got better, I would still have this pit of anxiety in my stomach right before bed. Eventually, I realized that this anxiety I would experience before bed actually wasn't related to thoughts of my grandmother at all, but was just related and centralized around thoughts of death itself. Thoughts of me realizing I'm going to die, realizing that everyone I love will die, and then panicked thoughts of what happens after death. Now, something else to keep in mind with this is at this point in my life, I just graduated college. It was the middle of the COVID pandemic. There was a lot of transitions happening, and on top of me being in between, you know, just finished education, not yet started career, COVID kind of pausing time, I was also kind of in between belief systems at this point. I didn't really have a firm foundation of what I believed in to stand on when I was going through this hard time. So these symptoms of death anxiety that I had, they progressively got worse. It went from just having a ball of anxiety to these spiraling thoughts of the afterlife and death itself and everyone around me dying and how are we gonna die, and the fact that one day I'm going to die and there's nothing I can do about it. And it went into full-blown panic attacks, me bawling my eyes out, having trouble breathing, and of course not getting any sleep. This eventually bled from just before bedtime into my normal daily life, where I started to feel this intense anxiety related to me leaving my house. Death was so in my brain all the time that I started to just feel fear anytime I left the house. And I also started to feel this fear anytime someone I loved was away from me. So when my boyfriend would leave, I would get this fear of him getting into a car accident or him getting shot. And it was just these very irrational fears sticking in my brain that were all just around death. Now, at this point, you can probably see what I mean when I say there's a difference between death anxiety and a normal fear of death. Death anxiety is much more severe, really interferes with your daily life, and it's very physically and emotionally uncomfortable. Now, one of the first things that I want to say before jumping into how I kind of helped myself with death anxiety, if you are going through this right now, even if it's not as severe of symptoms as I had, or even if it's worse than what I had, just know that you're not alone. I think that it is much more common for people to experience death anxiety than what we think. When I was going through it, I definitely thought that I was alone. I thought I was the only person in the world that was struggling this hard with coming to accept death. It felt like everybody else in the world was fine with it, and I just for some reason wasn't, and I just didn't understand why it was happening. I think almost everybody will probably experience death anxiety at some point in their lives. I think some people don't experience it until they're much older and they start to feel their body changing and realizing that they are much closer to death than they used to be. And then some people, such as myself, experience it when they go through their first experience with death. Now, one of the first things that I want to talk about that was one of the methods that a lot of people recommend when you have trouble dealing with death, accepting death, or just have death anxiety is called death meditation. I don't want you to think about traditional meditation. Usually when I say meditation, people will think of like, you know, crisscross applesauce, you know, having your hands like this and going, but that is not this. This is not what we're doing. So for death meditation, this is basically you carving out a specific time of day when you are going to sit, you are going to think, and you are going to process through your thoughts on death and the afterlife. Now, I typically would recommend when you're doing this to have guidelines for yourself so you're not entering into just a spiral of thought. I would definitely try to make it structured more of like a journaling task. For me personally, I do actually journal because writing helps me process things better, but for you, maybe it will be speaking out loud, going on a drive. You know what works for you. Some prompts I would recommend is just kind of what do you believe happens after death, if anything. And if you don't know, you can take this time to explore different beliefs of what happens in the afterlife. Go through what do certain religions believe, what do certain cultures believe, and if that seems ridiculous, you know, write down why that seems ridiculous to you. Figure out what you resonate with and what you don't resonate with. I find that once you kind of have a baseline for what you believe in, it can be a little bit easier to deal with the anxiety because you have something to kind of hold on to. I would also ponder on your anxiety itself, letting yourself feel those anxious thoughts, write those thoughts down, and then kind of see if you can connect it back to, you know, the root cause. Like, why are you feeling this anxiety around death? Is it, you know, the fear of being forgotten? Is it the fear of loss? Just really try to kind of look into it as much as you can in a very organized manner, a very conscious manner. We're not trying to spiral, we're just trying to think. Now, something else to keep in mind with death meditation is that you don't want to do it before bed, because those thoughts will kind of bleed into your bedtime. And especially depending on where you are in your journey with death and with having death anxiety, this can be a very stressful process, especially at first, to confront those feelings, to confront basically death itself and kind of sort through it. So you really don't want to do that before bed when that's typically a time that you would need to relax. I recommend actually doing it in the morning if you can, just because that gives you so much time to experience your day, experience so many other things to kind of help you relax after you go through a death meditation. In addition, by doing it earlier in the day and having this designated time to think those thoughts, I actually found that it would help me not have those anxiety spirals right before bed. It was almost like my brain had these thoughts that were just swirling around, and if I gave them time to come out, then I was fine. But if I went my whole day not thinking about it and distracting myself, then the only time they could come out was right before bed. Now, the second part to how I kind of helped my death anxiety or helped myself come to terms with death involved a lot of research. So I don't really remember exactly who led me this direction, but I remember being told that in order to kind of help conquer fears about death and help with death anxiety, you need to learn more about death, because so much of our fear comes from the unknown and the uncontrollable. We have no control over when or how it happens. We also have no control over what happens after, if anything. I would say for the average person, we don't really know a lot of the processes of death, of what happens to our body when we're dying, what happens to our body after we die. There's just so many unknown variables that I was recommended to take as much time as I could to research death. The goal is to make as much known about death as possible, and by gathering more information, we kind of gain a sense of control around death as well. Now, again, just a note, it will be uncomfortable to start this research process, to read books about death, watch videos about death if you are in the midst of a very heightened state of death anxiety. Of course, you know what's best for yourself, but just be aware of that. For me, I personally had to push myself to go and read these books and watch these videos. Now, I will make a separate video that has all of the resources that I researched to kind of help with my death anxiety, as well as what I'm currently looking at and what I still want to look into regarding death. But what I can tell you is some of the major things that I've learned through my research, some of the key takeaways that have kind of helped me settle and in some sense accept death and learn to cope with my death anxiety. Now, one of the biggest things that I learned when I was doing my research, and it became apparent pretty early on, the culture around death in the West, and I guess I can speak more specifically for the US, the culture around death is failing us. In some ways, you could say our culture is obsessed with death and that we put it in all of our media. It's in movies, TV shows, books, songs, but in the same way, it's very taboo to talk about death in our culture. Now, I'm not saying this on an individual level, that if your best friend approached you, you know, because she was having anxiety about death, that you would reject her. But on a societal level, I think that typically it's kind of seen as not appropriate to bring up certain things around others. Death isn't something that our culture really promotes to us or wants us to remember, and because of that, we go such a long period of our times, most of us, without really encountering it or thinking about it in any serious way. And this is not to say that people don't know death happens. Of course people know that death happens, but the problem is that although we know it happens, I don't think we actually realize it or process that it's going to happen to us. Most of us live our lives not thinking about it until we have no choice but to think about it because something happens. And part of why I'm bringing this up is because historically in our culture, death would have been very prominent in our lives. We would have seen dead bodies very regularly. We would have been the ones to stand watch as our loved ones took their last breath. We would have been the ones to wash their bodies, to dress them, to carry them to the church. It would have been a community event for someone to die, and death would have been very well known. Because historically we were so involved with taking care of our dead and being there when people died, a lot of the processes of death were not a surprise. People knew the steps that a body went through when it was dying. People knew exactly what was going to happen to their bodies after they died because they did it for their friends and for their family. Versus now, death is so removed from us. In a lot of cases, people don't even die at home anymore. They die in the hospital, which I understand is not always your choice. But on top of that, even if they were to die at home, a lot of times people don't understand what's going on. They have a hospice nurse that's there taking care of them, having to explain everything because we're so far removed from it that we don't know what's normal for dying. We don't know what it looks like to die. We only see these very artistic depictions of death, which are usually not very accurate. And even after someone dies, we don't take care of our dead anymore in the same sense. We pay people to come and take them away, then put makeup on them so they don't look dead, they look like they're sleeping, and then we pay people to dig the hole and to bury them and to do all of these things. Not to say that it's necessarily bad, but the culture is just so different that we are very, very removed from death, which leads me to my point that we don't really see the real death. We see these artistic expressions of death. We see these attempts to kind of mask death in funerals with the makeup and the embalming so that it doesn't look like they're dead. But we don't see the real death, and because of that, we can't really be surprised when we have these shocking reactions to death when we're first presented with our mortality, because nothing in our culture has prepared us for it. Death is mysterious and it almost feels like a secret, and it's taboo to talk about, but everybody has this morbid curiosity where we want to know, we're curious about it, but for some reason our culture says that we shouldn't be and that it's weird to talk about. Not only are we emotionally unprepared when we do have to deal with death because it's not really been talked about in a serious way previously, but we're also kind of allowing ourselves and our family members to get taken advantage of financially. Now you might be wondering what I mean when I say financially, but if you really think about it, we live our lives just pretending death doesn't exist for the most part. We know it does, but we live like it doesn't. And so when someone dies, we haven't been looking up casket prices. We haven't been looking up burial methods. So a lot of time, the first time somebody's looking at the price of a casket or the price of a plot of land to get buried in or the price of cremation is when someone dies. So at this point, you're emotionally vulnerable because you've just lost someone that you've cared about. You're probably, you know, dealing with a lot of different pieces floating at once with people reaching out and having to deal with the will and dealing with the burial. And there's kind of a time mark on this where you have to get things done within so many days that people don't have the time to see if they're getting overcharged for a casket or if there were other options they should have looked at instead. A lot of times, especially when this happens earlier on in someone's life and they pass before anyone thought they would, there's like no preparation done for it, and it makes it so much easier for people to get scammed or people to get price gouged when they're trying to take care of their loved one. And I know that it can seem a little weird to assume that, you know, funeral homes, churches, places like this that handle the burials, handle the death process would be price gouging. They would be taking advantage of people, but they only exist because they were profitable. There is a whole death industry that you can learn about that profits on people not knowing anything until someone dies and they have to make these quick decisions. And it is so unfortunate that our culture's aversion to death makes us vulnerable in this way. So of course, death anxiety is more than expected when we live our entire lives without anybody really mentioning the giant elephant in the room. And so we just pretend like everything's fine. But once we're confronted with death, it is so shocking. It is so shocking that it is not a surprise that we get all of these symptoms of death anxiety, because we're confronting our own mortality for the first time in our lives. And it seems like everybody else is fine with it. Everybody else is living happy lives knowing that one day they're gonna die. And for some reason, it feels like we're the only ones that are affected by this. And then it's even worse because our culture makes it seem taboo to talk about death. So then it feels awkward if you try to bring up that you feel these feelings in any kind of public setting, because people are just like, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or that's weird, or just stop thinking about it. And it's just not helpful to the conversation. So what does all of this have to do with helping your death anxiety? It is not your fault that you have death anxiety. In fact, it is extremely normal for you to have it given the circumstances of our culture. We are not taught to expect any of this. We're not taught any information about death, about what happens to the body when it dies, what happens to the body after it dies. We talk about the afterlife way more, but even then, that's the one part that we really don't know about. It is totally normal for you to feel this death anxiety. It is so normal. It's just nobody talks about it because everyone thinks they're the weird one in the room for bringing it up, or they think they're morbid for thinking about it. But you're not morbid. What you're doing is natural. One of the greatest lessons that I've learned from conquering my death anxiety, facing it full force, and really looking death in the eye is that death is a great motivator. It is terrifying, and it is inevitable, and it is dark, but death is not a monster that's hunting you in the night. It is a natural part of life. And for me, I've learned that death exists so that I will live my best life. When you really think about it, when you have death looming over everything, simultaneously nothing matters, but everything matters. When you think about the small stuff that we care about way too much for some reason, like stuttering in a presentation, getting rejected for asking someone out, failing a test, all of these tiny things that we sometimes let rule over us, they don't matter in the shadow of death. They just don't, because one day we'll be gone and those things will never have mattered in the first place, and nobody will be there to remember that they mattered. But at the same time, because we know that it is all temporary, because all we know is we have this one life, there's no guarantee for anything in the afterlife. Maybe there is, but we don't know. This is our only life, so death is the greatest motivator to live it to its fullest. I mean this for big choices like asking someone out, starting a new job, moving to a new country. When you think about the fact that one day you will die, those choices get so much easier because it's really your only chance to do those things is in this life. But also with smaller decisions too. When we think about how much time we spend online on our phones, if you're spending 6 hours a day on TikTok, you're spending a significant amount of your life every day not even living, just staring at a screen. And that's not to say that social media itself is bad, but we should really be thinking about how we're living our lives, and death really just puts everything into perspective. At the end of your life, when you look back, what are you gonna wanna see that you did? You're gonna wanna see adventures, you're gonna wanna see friendships made, and love, and helping people and community. And the answer is so simple when you think, what do you wanna look back and see on your deathbed? But we forget that we die. Death is scary and it's permanent. And I think it's normal to be scared of it, to have a healthy amount of fear. But the anxiety that a lot of us carry about death, I think comes more from just not knowing. Because death is shrouded in mystery and nobody talks about it, it is so hard for us to process our thoughts around death. And I think this really just manifests in anxiety. I honestly think it's really important to kind of use the tools that I mentioned, like researching as much as you can, and also really thinking about what you believe in, because I think the more that we uncover this mystery of death and unlock all of these secrets, the more comforting it can be to learn, to understand why we feel this way, that it's normal to feel this way. And ultimately what I've, kind of taken away from all of my research is that death is just a reminder to live well. We can't control a lot about death. We can't control anything really about the afterlife, but we can control how we live. And I think that is just the most important takeaway we can get when we have death anxiety. I hope that this was able to help you. Honestly, even if it helped one person, then I think it's worth it. I really made this video more for me because this is the video I wish that I had when I was first experiencing my death anxiety. Just knowing I'm not alone, knowing that there is a way to get out of it, and seeing the good in it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.